Some of the things that the mainstream media continues to report about my sister, if you do a Google search on Terri's name, you'll often see that the reporter is being in a coma, is being brain dead, that she was had some type of underlying terminal disease, that she was in a persistent vegetative state. All of this is false. And again, I think it's done purposely to continue to desensitize us to the value and dignity of people that simply have a cognitive disability. And that was really what we're talking about here, that my sister had a profound brain injury. In fact, I think a lot of people, when I go out and speak, one of the things that I say is that if Terri were alive today, that she could be here with us. All she needed was a wheelchair. We could take her anywhere. It'd be a little difficult getting her here, a long trip here to Alaska, but nevertheless, if we had to, we could. We could bring her here to be with us, to join us here tonight. So, but again, the way Terri's condition was portrayed, they want us to look at her and think that she had such a poor quality of life that the humane thing to do would be just to end her life. And it's in 1984 when she met Bobby Schindler at a community college in just outside of Philadelphia, and they married, and we all, in 1986, my mom and dad relocated to Florida, St. Petersburg, and Terri and Michael followed, and then I followed the next year in 1987. So we're all in Florida by 1987. It was 1990 when I got a call. Terri and I lived in the same apartment complex, and as I said, we're very close. In fact, I had just saw her the night that I got the call from my father telling me to get over to Terri's because something had happened. She had collapsed, and I had just we had spent some time earlier in the evening, and I got there, and Michael opened the door. He was hysterical, and I remember walking over, and Terri was face down on the ground. And I leaned over, and I wasn't too concerned at the time because I had just saw her, as I said, and I thought perhaps she just fainted or passed out. And I remember I leaned down and shook her shoulder, and she was unresponsive, although I heard her breathing, although it was labored. The paramedics got there almost immediately after I was there trying to get my sister to wake her up. And as soon as they went over and evaluated her, I knew something was wrong, seriously wrong, because they went into that mode and started treating her because her heart had stopped and they weren't getting a pulse. And they must have hit her with the defibrillators at least a half a dozen times to try to get her heart started, which they did. And I think after it must have been a half hour, 45 minutes, able to stabilize her enough to transport her to the hospital. But she had went several minutes, unbeknownst at the time, without oxygen, which led to her profound brain injury. At first, we didn't know if Terri was going to live or die, but she did come through that, and she was hooked up to all types of machines initially. Before she was in a coma initially, but she emerged from this to the point where she was no longer in a coma. She was awake, and the only thing keeping her alive was a feeding tube. She had difficulty swallowing because of her brain injury, and she needed a feeding tube that went into her stomach. She was getting aggressive rehabilitation and therapy for the first 2 years, and she was starting to speak. She was starting to form words. So our family was very encouraged. So was Michael at the time. Very encouraged with what we were seeing with my sister improving. If you know anybody with a profound brain injury, even the slightest improvement gives families hope and really provides, not that we would ever agree or ever thought for one second that we would ever abandon my sister, but nevertheless, even any little improvement gave our family a considerable amount of hope. Unfortunately, after about 2 years in 1992, Michael and our family had a rift, and Michael, really from that point on, 1992, 93, he went on to his efforts. He went on his pursuit to end Terri's life. And without getting into all the details, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to answer them at the end. But our family fought very hard from that point on, and it wasn't until 2000 when Michael petitioned the court in 1998, petitioned the court that he was going to now take the steps to remove Terri's food and water through a feeding tube, that our family was blindsided, that we realized really what we're up against. And then it took 2 years before it did go to the courts. It was a week-long trial. And then and it was the first week, it was, I believe, the third week in January down in Florida. We had a week-long trial. And then it was February 11th, 2000, that the judge ordered that Terri's feeding tube could be removed. And then our family fought very hard for almost 5 years, a little over 5 years actually, and we were unsuccessful. And Terri died almost over a 2-week period of going without food and water. And in the course of those 5 years, again, not knowing how much you watched of my sister's situation, but we were getting more and more support, and we were having the support of the Florida legislature. We had Governor Jeb Bush support trying to enact laws. The legislature was trying to enact law to protect my sister, which they actually did. Governor Bush was trying to help. It had moved all the way up to the Congress of the United States in 2004 it started, where the President Bush eventually, the Congress passed law, President Bush got involved. We had Vatican officials that were involved in trying to save my sister's life. We even had the 4 pro-lifers in Hollywood were trying to help my sister. That was kind of a joke, because not many pro-lifers in Hollywood. But the reason I say this is because having this type of, and again, perhaps you in here this evening, I hear all the time writing emails and letters to different officials trying to get help supporting our family and Terri's right to life. But regardless of all this, regardless of the governor of Florida, regardless of the President of the United States, regardless of Vatican officials being involved to try and help my sister, we were unable. And the culture of death was successful in ending my sister's life. And I think that's kind of an indication of where we've come as a nation, where something that we considered barbaric and inhumane not that long ago, deliberately starving, dehydrating a human being to death, to where today it's become ordinary. And again, I totally understand what Dan was saying, because if you even try to explain to people the parallels that are occurring now in hospitals, in our healthcare facilities across the country, even if you even try to show the parallels with what's happening prior to the Holocaust, the T4 program, what was happening in the hospitals back in Germany, I mean, people look at you as a radical, that you're how can you even bring something up like that and compare it to what's happening in the hospitals today? But it absolutely is, because it's the same premise. It's the mentally and the physically inferior, the useless eaters. And hospitals are now, it's in their best interest to do what they can to end the lives of these individuals. And they have convinced us, for whatever reason, that this is something that should be accepted. I think to this day, Terri's case is often confused, and why people think that she was on all types of machines. Because if you read the newspaper accounts, they'll write that Terri was taken off life support, that she was hooked up to artificial life support. Well, technically, I guess you could say that's correct, because they have redefined what it means to receive food and water through feeding tubes as artificial life support. But people, our society doesn't understand that this shift has been made. So when you hear artificial life support, right away it goes, and we think that this person must be on machines, which in fact it is not true. So when they write these reports, they would seldom say artificial life support, and somehow, which means food and water through a feeding tube. But you would rarely read that in these newspaper accounts. The PVS diagnosis, and again, this goes back to and again what Dan was saying. How can we shift? And I'm just going over a few of the dynamics that are occurring in our culture today. But again, I think this was a diagnosis that was created in the early 70s, and from this we were able to subjectively diagnose somebody as being in a condition that allows us to kill them. Because if a person, again, state law dictates, I know it does in Florida, if a person is considered to be in a persistent vegetative state, then law dictates that we can end that person's life if the guardian chooses to. The problem is the PVS diagnosis, it's figuratively and literally extremely dangerous. Figuratively because it's, well, let me go back. First say that the diagnosis is completely subjective. It's under the discretion of the doctor. And again, it's an absence of awareness. It's not being able to interact with your environment, okay? And I'm going to show you a video in just a moment of my sister, not quite yet, Thomas, but in a second, of my sister not even coming close to meeting this criteria. But yet the judge, and based on doctor's testimony that came in and testified on behalf of Michael Schiavo, the judge agreed with the testimony, even though the video was completely contrary to the PVS diagnosis. But it's also dangerous in the sense that when you refer to somebody, and what has morphed from persistent vegetative state is calling someone a vegetable. And again, it goes into dehumanizing individuals, where they're no longer alive human beings, which they are. They've now become vegetables. Again, it's verbal engineering. It's a way of dehumanizing these people to accept this as being a compassionate thing to do to an individual. But how it's become literally a death sentence is what I just told you, is they use it as a criteria in law to end a person's life. But figuratively, it also becomes a death sentence, because once a doctor diagnoses somebody as being in a PVS, their insurance will cut that person off for any type of future rehabilitation therapy. And the biggest thing that these individuals need with these brain injuries is rehabilitation therapy. But as soon as they're diagnosed as in BVS, the insurance, whatever insurance they have, and I believe it would be for Medicaid and Medicare as well, they're basically cut off. And what happens? The family doesn't have the resources to able to afford what they need, rehabilitation therapy, and they're abandoned in warehouse and basically given up on. And the family is in despair and suffering because they're no longer in a position to provide what these individuals need. And as a society, again, we have grown to accept this. But I want to show you now, don't start it yet, Thomas, but you can bring it up. This is in 2002. And again, remember the definition of PVS. And this is what the judge saw. The definition of PVS is having no awareness, is unable to respond or interact with your environment, and unable to follow commands. This was in 2002. This was submitted to the judge for proof. And the voice that you hear is a neurologist, and you'll understand once you watch it. It's less than a minute long.
Terri? Open your eyes. Open your eyes. Terri, open your eyes. Terri, good. Good job. Good job, lady. Good job.
It took Terri a couple seconds for her to process the command. That's why there was a hesitation when the doctor was saying, open your eyes, before she actually listened to him. But the doctors, when she responded this way, the doctor felt it was remarkable, given the fact that from 1992, and this was in 2002, for the better part of 10 years, Terri was warehoused and abandoned by Michael Schiavo, her guardian and husband, and she was denied all rehabilitation and therapy, even range of motion. So the fact that, and if you know anybody, again, that has these types of catastrophic brain injuries, if they're not constantly given range of motion, stimulation, rehabilitation and therapy, they're going to deteriorate. So the fact that Terri was able to respond like this was quite remarkable and disproved this notion that she was in a PVS condition. Thank you, Dan. I don't have to get into the whole personhood theory, but I too talk about Peter Singer and the bioethics movement and what's occurring in our country today and how they are having such an impact on our future doctors and nurses. In fact, I go back to Wesley Smith's Culture of Death book that he wrote many years ago, sounding the alarm of the medical ethics, of the onslaught, if you will, of the modern-day bioethics movement. And I speak in general terms. Obviously, when I speak of doctors, attorneys, the bioethicists, they're not all, lack of a better way of saying it, they're not all bad. In fact, Wesley Smith is one of the good ones. But we're seeing more and more of them accept this premise that certain people are human non-persons, and therefore it should become up to us whether or not they should live. And we should have the decision whether or not they should live or die, based on someone's quality of life. Back, I bring up Wesley again, and again, just to show you, this is Professor Bill Allen. And where is he a bioethicist at? He's a bioethicist at the University of Florida. And they had a debate on, I believe it was national TV, and Wesley just cuts to the chase and said, Bill, they were debating Terri's situation. He said, do you believe Terri is a person? And you see his answer, no, I do not. And you don't think that these professors are having an impact on our doctors and our nurses and our healthcare professionals of the future? It's happening right now. This has been going on for many, many years, long before. In fact, Michael Schiavo's attorney, George Philo, said back when Terri's case was starting to make the national news that it did, he said, I don't understand why this case is making so much attention. He said there has been tens of thousands of people like Terri that have already been killed this way, meaning the removal of food and hydration. So this is something that was happening long before Terri's case started and continues to happen every single day in our culture. And these are some of the dynamics why I think we become more and more or less and less compassionate when and I think it's something more which I'll get into in a moment. But I just put up, and again, I don't need to go over this again, but these are just some pictures of people that are in our culture today are now considered human non-persons. And I have Ronald Reagan up there. Does anybody know why? He had Alzheimer's. And under these bioethicist personhood theories, someone with Alzheimer's is considered a non-person. So therefore, it should be up to us whether or not they live or die. In fact, it's happening every day where people with Alzheimer's are being systematically killed. Again, the media, and I think if probably, if anything, tonight, and there's the dynamics and why our culture has shifted, why we are accepting this more and more. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of dynamics. I'm just picking out a few here tonight, but I think the media has a tremendous impact on our culture today. And again, I'll tell you, and I'll give you some evidence of that. But anybody know Nat Hentoff? He's one of the good guys in the media with the pro-life. He's actually a Jewish atheist, but he's into disability rights. He's into the protection of people like Terri with these disabilities. And this was back in 2003 when he wrote this article. He said the title was "Lying About Terri Schiavo," and he said to his colleagues, I mean, he'd been in the business for what, 40, 50 years, and he's one of the most respected journalists out there. And he said when it came to describing or writing about Terri's case, it was one of the worst cases of journalistic malpractice that he's seen. And he had covered the Karen Ann Quinlan case and the Nancy Cruzan case, two big cases that made a lot of attention. So we saw back in 2003 the impact that the press was having on covering Terri's case. This is a DJ. Now, the only reason I put this up there, because there's message boards out there that just write about Terri in the most horrible ways. But the reason I put this guy up there, and appropriately his name is Bubba the Love Sponge, he's on Sirius, that Sirius Internet Radio, and he's got millions. He's one of them. He's up there with like a Howard Stern, who's very popular, and this guy is very popular. He's got 4 radio stations, and also he's on this Internet radio. And whenever he talks about Terri, and I don't know how much he does anymore, I'm sure he does. This was in 2010. This is how he describes her. This is how he describes my sister. And I hate to even put it up there because it is so offensive. But you don't think that has an impact, people listening, on people with these types of profound brain injuries and the prejudices that are not only we have but are growing towards people like my sister? Just in 1 second, Thomas. This was in 2010, so this wasn't that long ago. This was 5 years after Terri's death. We've all heard of The Family Guy. And you all heard of The Family Guy? It's one of the most popular shows on TV. And this, again, this demographics of this are high school kids and college kids. Well, we came across something that we didn't know was occurring. It occurred at the time. We got a link saying that the night before that The Family Guy did a skit on my sister. And it was the opening of the show. And I'd like you just to watch this it's just less than 2 minutes if you take a moment to watch this.
I am so excited for Stewie's first play.
Don't you think it's a little soon for a musical about Terri Schiavo?
Or too late.
Shh, it's starting.
Schiavo. How's my wife doing?
She's a vegetable.
I hate vegetables.
Don't worry about her, Mr. Schiavo. She's being kept alive by medical science.
Gee, look at all this stuff. How does it all work?
Well, I'll tell you.
This one keeps her liver clean. This one checks her pee.
How about this one over here?
Oh, that's just a TV.
Ha ha ha!
This one checks her heart rate. This one checks her veins. brains.
Oh, 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 Terri Schiavo is kind of a lipo. What a lively little bugger.
Maybe we should just unplug her.
Terri Schiavo is kind of a lipo. The most expensive plant you'll ever see.
There's only one solution. It's in the Constitution. We've got to pull the plug.
I mean, they didn't even get my sister's situation correctly. I mean, she wasn't hooked up to all those type of machines as they portrayed, but that's beside the point. I mean, this is terribly offensive. And you know what the default is of these people? Oh, come on. You need to learn to laugh at this stuff. It's just a joke. But unfortunately, my mom got to see that. And that's not a joke to her, nor is it to me, nor is it to the people that are caring for these individuals that have these types of brain injuries. And the prejudices that exist, and they're continuing to grow towards these individuals. And something like this, well, that could be true, Mr. Bird. But you know, it brings up a point too. That, I mean, who do we point the finger at here? Do we point the finger at Seth McPherson, I believe is the producer of this, and that DJ? Do we point the finger at him, or do we point the finger at us? Meaning, if we didn't watch or support these shows, or listen to him, or watch that TV program, then they wouldn't be on. But obviously, we support these. The advertisers come out and support them with millions of dollars. So this continues. So until it really is a reflection upon us that we support this type of garbage. And it really brings me to really going back to the abortion issue and this issue, because I think we have a much tougher issue to get the support of, like we have been with the gains that we've been making or the progress we've been making in the abortion issue. And I think, again, it's this underlying, I think, this prejudice or that exists against people with disabilities, profound disabilities. Because what I think happens here, you look at a baby, and we say to ourselves, yes, we need to fight as hard as we can to preserve the life of that unborn child and fight for that baby so it has a life. But then we look at someone like my sister in her broken state. And although we might say to ourselves as pro-lifers, yes, she has value and dignity, but who would want to live that way? And I think this question is driving a lot of our fears and driving a lot of the way in which we choose to support this issue. But the wrong question is being asked. Because nobody would choose to live this way if given the choice. Nobody would choose to live with a disability. But something we all have to understand is that there are people living this way. Tens of thousands, if not now more. In fact, the New York Times, of all papers, recently did a story on people in these types of conditions. And they estimate upwards of 200,000 people are in similar conditions to my sister with these types of catastrophic brain injuries. So, again, the question really falls upon us. Not who would want to live this way. What are we going to do to protect these individuals? I think we also see it, the prejudice that exists. And again, I go back to the New York Times. They did a story where they found that 90% of families are aborting babies that are diagnosed as having some type of disability or Down syndrome before they're born. Well, if we're seeing that such a high rate percentage of families that are not even wanting to care for their disability, their child with a disability, and aborting that child, you don't think that prejudice exists to those that are already born with these disabilities? Again, I think it gives us it speaks to, I think, how we look at these individuals, and perhaps we're dealing with our own fears in wanting to care for these people or wanting to support people with these types of so-called quality of life. I mean, this isn't easy. This is a difficult issue. I mean, dedicating your life to having to care for someone with these types of disabilities, it's a very difficult, particularly in the beginning, when the family is faced with knowing that perhaps their loved one is not going to improve. Their quality of life is going to be as such where they're going to need constant care and love. But I think after the family accepts that, as our family did and other families do, they come to the understanding that God put this person in their life And it's a way for them to express their love and their compassion in a way that we can't do with an able-bodied person. And we talk to families all the time, and they consider themselves blessed that they are caring for individuals that have these types of disabilities and able to express their love and compassion to someone that is completely vulnerable. March 18th, 2005 is when my sister's feeding tube was removed. And again, we can't do this to an animal or those on death row. It's a felony crime. I know at least in Florida we would go to jail. But yet we're doing it to our most innocent, vulnerable people in our country and really globally today. And again, I put these pictures up here, and something Dan touched on. But people would ask me, what was it like walking into your room and seeing your sister? What did she look like? The media was just so interested in wanting to know what Terri looked like. And the only thing I could think of are the pictures of Auschwitz. And I got to tell you, seeing my sister those last couple days, these pictures do not do justice on how much my sister physically deteriorated and how terrible it ravaged her body. And I can get into some pretty graphic details of how she physically deteriorated. We told my mom, I think it was 3 or 4 days before Terri died, we would no longer let her visit her because of how much physically grotesque she looked from the effects of dehydration and starvation. My father, who died, passed away in 2009, told me privately one time that, and my dad became very depressed, as you can imagine. I'm not a father, so I've never had my own child. My dad told me one time, he said, you'll never understand what it is to love something until you have your own child. And he told me, not long after Terri's death, that he was never able to forgive himself for not being able to do more to protect his daughter. And my dad died with that on his heart, and literally died of heart failure. And something, I don't know if it was more difficult for me walking into a room for almost 2 weeks and watching my sister die this way, or walking into a room and watching my parents watch their daughter die this way without anything they could do to stop it. I don't know if you can read that, but George Philos, Michael's Schiavo's attorney, came out and did a press conference just a couple days before Terri's death and said this to a nation that was watching. And this is the narrative that you'll hear from people that support this issue, that this is a painless and peaceful way to die. And again, this is the furthest thing from the truth. But it's the lie they have to tell. It's the same lie that they tell about abortion and the unborn child. They come up with ways that they want us to accept this because they don't want us to know the reality of the situation and really what was happening in the confines of that room. In fact, Father Pavone came out not too long after this and gave his own press conference. Father Pavone was able to go in there and witness what was happening and tell everybody that this was just a lie. We are now in the position of we help families. And this is just one example of the countless cases that we get called. We get calls now from our foundation. And as you can see, this was of a woman. This was the niece had called us because the sister of this woman was guardian. And if you read that, you can see that she had a minor stroke. And she had good vitals. And if you see the next line, it says she's awake and conscious and being starved and dehydrated to death. And she eventually died this way. There was nothing they can do because the guardian decided to take away her food and water, which is medical treatment, and she had every right to do so. The woman was not in a condition where she could make choices on her own. And this is the result. As I said, Terri, as a result of what happened to my sister's situation, our family wanted to continue to try and advocate for these families because we saw really what was happening on a day-to-day basis, being completely naive when we started this battle to save my sister's life. We have 3 basic goals: to raise awareness, educate the public, and help families that call us for help. One of the families that recently called us through the attorney was the Jahai McMath family. And some of you might have heard of the Jahai McMath. We became so hyper-focused. And again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning. The press made this about brain death and that the family was being unreasonable. This is not, we are so hyper-focused on this brain death diagnosis, which itself has its own problems. And when you tie that into the organ donation program, and again, it goes back to the it goes back to the creation, this medical community, creating a diagnosis, this brain death diagnosis, because did you know that you cannot harvest organs from a dead person? You can only harvest organs from a person that's alive. So they had to create some way of getting at organs while the person's alive, hence the brain death diagnosis. Because the person is technically, from my understanding, is not, although they have the brain death diagnosis, they're still alive. But we're really missing the point in the Jahia McMath case. We came out, and so the family reached out to us, which always has to happen. We don't impose ourselves on situations unless the family reaches out to us. And they did through the attorney in this case. And this is about, again, parental rights. Who is going to make decisions for loved ones in these types of situations? Is it going to be hospitals, hospital boards, ethics committees, or is it going to be us? Is it going to be our family? And this hospital, after they put Jahia in the condition in the first place through a procedure that went awry, now they were declaring her brain dead. And the family, who I've been able to visit on 3 or 4 occasions, told me that the organ donation team, or the people behind our organ donations, were there within a day of them declaring Jahia brain death. Well, they wanted time, and they should be afforded that time to see if they saw signs in their daughter that they believed provided them hope. And they should be afforded this time if they want it. And unfortunately, they were able to get it through fighting the hospital and having her transferred. And as I said, I was able to visit Jahia and the family on a few occasions, and she is, to this day, she is physically doing well and showing signs of improvement. Now, where this will go, we don't know. But she at the moment, she is doing very, she at least physically is doing well. Neurologically, she needs help. But again, we have to understand what this is about. It's about who is in the position to make medical determinations for loved ones. This is Brendan Flynn, who was involved in a catastrophic car accident, a fatal car accident, I'm sorry, where his friend was killed. Brendan, long story short, Brendan was air vac to a hospital. The doctor said he was going to make no significant improvement, no significant quality of life. They recommended to the mom that he put him in a room and let him die. The mom said, no, I want you to treat my son. And in this case, the hospital acquiesced it, and they did treat Brendan by the parents' orders. And today, Brendan has a daughter and a beautiful young child, and he actually goes out in public, speaks now about what almost happened to him. The question was, what were Michael Schiavo, the guardian's motives, incentives to end my sister's life? And it's hard to know a man's heart. There was a considerable amount of money, close to $1 million at the time that he was a guardian. And a guardian has an exceedingly amount of power over an individual. Whoever the guardian is of a loved one, I mean, and in Michael's case, he really turned out to use it as a weapon against our family. He became guardian unbeknownst to my mom and dad, but he had enormous conflicts of interest. In fact, we thought there was no way a judge would ever entertain his petition to remove my sister's food and water. I mean, he had the money that he was going to inherit if Terri died. He was living with another woman who he had fathered 2 children with. He said that he was his fiancée. He had asked her to marry her while still being married to my sister. And Terri's so-called wishes, and that was the basis of Michael removing the feeding tube. He said that Terri didn't have an advance directive. He said almost 10 years after Terri's collapse in 1990, that Terri had made express wishes, verbal wishes, before her collapse, that if she ever became incapacitated, she wouldn't want to live this way. It was all hearsay evidence. The judge accepted it. All these conflicts of interest, said he believed Michael and didn't believe my family, and therefore the battle ensued. So yes, it's interesting. Mostly when I speak to kids, I speak to a lot of high schools and colleges, and usually one of the first questions I get is, can you, and I speak mostly in Catholic. I don't think the public schools want me to speak. I haven't spoken to too many public institutions, but one of the first questions is, have you forgiven Michael, or how do you feel about Michael now? And I think forgiveness, not to get into, but I think for me anyway, forgiveness has been, it's been, I pray for God's grace to find that forgiveness. And there's some days that I do. I pray a lot about it, and I do. I feel like I find forgiveness in my heart for Michael. There's other days I'm very angry, particularly when I think about my father and mother and how much they suffered at his hands. But then I tell the kids, I say, look, I think the most powerful thing we can do, or what we can do, is we need to pray for Michael. Because can you imagine if he's had a conversion, and he was up here speaking to you tonight, or today. His witness, I think, would be much more powerful. He's up here telling you he was wrong than it would be from my witness. So I think we have to pray for that, and hopefully, with God, He can do anything, and perhaps that someday that will happen. So.